"You're coming with me," said the British Guard. After seeing POW women shivering in thin dresses, December 1943, Russian women's internment camp, Port Erin, Isle of Man. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the overcast sky, settling on the frost-hardened ground of what had once been a peaceful seaside resort town. The village of Port Erin, now repurposed as Europe's only all-female internment camp, stood stark against the white landscape that stretched toward the Irish Sea. Victorian boarding houses, their windows now barred and doors guarded, lined the narrow streets where holidaymakers had once strolled in happier times. The camp housed over 4,000 women, primarily German and Austrian civilians who had been classified as enemy aliens by the British government following the outbreak of war in 1939. Many were refugees who had fled Nazi persecution, only to find themselves detained by the very nation they had sought as sanctuary. Others were wives of German nationals, teachers, governesses, and domestic workers who had been living peacefully in Britain when war transformed them overnight from residents into potential security threats. Inside the camp's administrative office, a coal stove struggled against the December chill, while maps of the British Isles covered one wall, red pins marking the locations of internment facilities across the country. By late 1943, Britain held thousands of civilian internees on the Isle of Man alone, a number that had fluctuated throughout the war as security concerns balanced against humanitarian considerations and the practical needs of the war economy. Sergeant James MacLeod, a 35-year-old veteran of the Scottish Highland Regiment, walked briskly through the camp's main thoroughfare, his breath forming visible puffs in the frigid air. His left leg carried a slight limp, a souvenir from shrapnel that had found him during the brutal fighting in North Africa 18 months earlier. The injury had ended his frontline service but not his military career, leading to his reassignment to guard duty at Russian, where his experience and steady temperament made him valuable for managing the complex dynamics of civilian internment. MacLeod's uniform was immaculate despite the harsh conditions, his boots polished to a shine that reflected his disciplined nature and military bearing. He had served with distinction in the Western Desert, earning the respect of his men through a combination of tactical skill and unwavering adherence to military protocol. The transition from active combat to civilian supervision had been challenging, requiring different skills and a more nuanced understanding of the legal and humanitarian obligations that governed internment operations. As he approached the central courtyard where morning roll call was conducted, MacLeod's sharp eyes caught sight of a group of women internees standing near the camp's eastern perimeter. They wore thin civilian dresses and coats that had been adequate for their previous lives in Britain's cities, but provided insufficient protection against the harsh winter conditions of the exposed Isle of Man. Their faces were pale, lips tinged blue, and they shivered uncontrollably as they waited for the daily inspection that camp regulations required. Among them stood Greta Hoffmann, a 28-year-old Jewish refugee from Berlin who had fled Germany in 1938 following Kristallnacht. She had worked as a nurse in a London hospital until her internment in May 1940, when the British government's fears of a German invasion led to the mass detention of enemy aliens regardless of their personal circumstances or political loyalties. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight bun beneath a makeshift headscarf fashioned from a torn piece of fabric, and her eyes, though weary from years of displacement and detention, held a quiet dignity that imprisonment had not broken. Beside her stood Maria Rossi, a 24-year-old Italian woman who had come to Britain in 1939 as a domestic worker for a wealthy family in London. Her marriage to a German engineer had resulted in her classification as an enemy alien when Italy entered the war in June 1940, despite her personal opposition to fascism and her desire to remain in Britain. Her dark curls peeked out from beneath a headscarf similar to Greta's, and her gaze remained fixed on the ground as she struggled to maintain her composure in the face of the bitter cold that had gripped the island for weeks. The other women in the group represented the diverse population that had found itself caught in the expanding web of wartime security measures. There was Elena Marchetti, a 30-year-old Italian teacher who had been working in a London school, Ingrid Weber, a 26-year-old German governess who had cared for the children of a British diplomat, and Anna Kowalski, a Polish refugee in her early 30s who had been detained on suspicion of having German sympathies, though no evidence had ever been presented to support the allegation. MacLeod's jaw tightened as he observed the scene before him. He had been briefed on the internees' backgrounds and the circumstances of their detention, but seeing them in such a vulnerable state stirred something within him that he had not expected. The Geneva Convention guidelines, which Britain had pledged to follow even for civilian internees, mandated humane treatment including adequate shelter, clothing, and medical care. Yet here they stood, clearly suffering from exposure to conditions that could reasonably be considered dangerous to their health and well-being. The sergeant had spent enough time in harsh conditions to recognize the signs of hypothermia and exposure. The blue-tinged lips, the uncontrollable shivering, the glazed look in their eyes all pointed to a medical emergency in the making. He had seen soldiers suffer from exposure in the desert nights of North Africa, and the sight of these women in their inadequate clothing triggered memories of those experiences and a professional understanding of the serious health risks they faced. The winter of 1943 to 44 had been particularly brutal throughout the British Isles, with temperatures dropping well below normal and persistent snow coverage that strained heating systems and supply lines. The Isle of Man, exposed to Atlantic weather systems and lacking the infrastructure to support such a large population, had struggled to maintain adequate living conditions for the thousands of internees housed in facilities that had never been designed for long-term residential use. Dame Joanna Cruikshank, the former matron of the British Red Cross who served as the camp's administrator, had repeatedly requested additional supplies and resources from the Home Office, but wartime priorities and bureaucratic delays had left many needs unmet. The women's clothing, much of which consisted of the garments they had been wearing when detained years earlier, was wholly inadequate for the island's harsh winter climate. Without a word, MacLeod turned on his heel and marched toward the supply depot, a converted Victorian villa that housed the camp's inventory of clothing, blankets, and other essential supplies. Inside, he found Corporal Davies, a young soldier from Wales with a perpetually nervous demeanor, who had been assigned to manage the camp's logistics. Davies looked up from his inventory sheets with surprise as the sergeant entered, clearly not expecting a visit from a senior non-commissioned officer at this early hour. "Corporal, gather any spare blankets and coats you can find," MacLeod ordered, his voice carrying the authority of years of military command. Davies blinked in confusion, his pencil hovering over the papers he had been reviewing. "For the internees, sir?" he asked, uncertainty evident in his voice. The question reflected the complex dynamics that existed within the camp, where humanitarian concerns often came into conflict with security protocols and resource limitations. "Yes, for the internees," MacLeod snapped, his patience worn thin by the urgency of the situation. "Now move." The corporal scrambled to comply, pulling blankets from storage shelves and gathering several heavy coats that had been donated by local civilian organizations and charitable groups on the mainland. The British public had been encouraged to contribute clothing and other supplies for internees, both as a humanitarian gesture and as a demonstration of British values, in contrast to the treatment of civilians in Nazi-occupied territories. Minutes later, MacLeod returned to the courtyard, his arms laden with blankets and coats, steam rising from his breath in the frigid air. The women internees watched him warily, their experience having taught them to be suspicious of any unexpected attention from their guards. Many had heard stories of internees being singled out for additional questioning or punishment, and the sight of a senior guard approaching with supplies was so unusual that it triggered immediate anxiety among the group. "You're coming with me," MacLeod said, his voice gruff, but carrying an undertone that was not unkind. The words would later become part of the oral history of the camp, representing a moment when military protocol gave way to basic human compassion. The women exchanged uncertain glances, communicating through subtle gestures and expressions the fear and confusion that MacLeod's unexpected intervention had created. Greta stepped forward slightly, her experience as a nurse having taught her to assess situations quickly and make decisions under pressure. "Where are we going?" she asked in English that carried only a slight German accent, the result of years of living and working in London before her internment. MacLeod gestured toward an unused section of one of the boarding houses that had been prepared to accommodate additional internees, but remained empty due to recent transfers to other facilities. The building was one of several Victorian structures that had been requisitioned by the government and converted for use as internment facilities. Inside, the air was marginally warmer than the outdoor temperature, though still far from comfortable. The rooms contained simple furnishings, iron bedsteads, and a small coal fireplace that had not been lit for several weeks due to fuel rationing. McLeod immediately set about starting a fire, using kindling and coal from a supply box near the entrance. "Put these on," he instructed, handing out the blankets and coats to each woman in turn. "Can't have you falling ill on my watch." The statement reflected both his practical concerns about maintaining the health of internees under his supervision and a growing personal investment in their welfare that surprised him with its intensity. Greta hesitated before accepting a heavy wool coat that had clearly been donated by a civilian, its style and cut suggesting it had belonged to a middle-aged British woman. "Thank you," she murmured, her English clear and articulate despite the stress of the situation. The gratitude in her voice was genuine, reflecting not just appreciation for the immediate relief from the cold, but recognition of the risk that McLeod was taking by departing from standard procedures. Maria nodded as she wrapped a thick blanket around her shoulders, adding grazie in Italian, her voice barely above a whisper. McLeod cleared his throat, uncomfortable with their expressions of gratitude and the implications of what he had just done. "Just following regulations," he muttered, though all present understood that his interpretation of those regulations was generous and that no specific orders had been given to provide special treatment for the internees. His discomfort reflected the complex emotions that many guards experienced when confronted with the humanity of their charges, a recognition that challenged the psychological distance necessary for effective security operations. Over the following days, McLeod found himself observing the women more closely during his regular rounds of the camp. He noticed how they had adapted to their circumstances, creating small communities within the larger internee population and maintaining their dignity despite the challenging conditions. They shared their meager rations to ensure that the weakest among them received adequate nutrition, maintained informal educational programs to keep their minds active, and provided emotional support to those struggling with the uncertainty and isolation of indefinite detention. The women had developed their own informal support networks based on their professional backgrounds and personal strengths. Greta, with her medical training, had naturally assumed responsibility for monitoring the health of her fellow internees, using her knowledge to identify early signs of illness and injury. Maria's domestic experience made her valuable for organizing living spaces and maintaining sanitary conditions. Elena, despite the trauma of losing her teaching position, had established informal classes in English and other subjects for internees who wanted to improve their skills. One evening, as McLeod made his final rounds of the day, he heard soft singing emanating from the women's section of the camp. The melody was unfamiliar to him, but the harmony was hauntingly beautiful, carrying across the quiet compound with a poignancy that seemed to capture the longing and hope that sustained the internees through their ordeal. He paused outside the building, listening to voices that blended German, Italian, and English words in songs that transcended language barriers and national divisions. The music served multiple purposes within the camp community, providing emotional comfort, maintaining cultural connections, and creating a sense of solidarity that helped internees cope with the isolation and uncertainty of their situation. The songs included traditional folk melodies from their homelands, popular tunes from before the war, and new compositions that reflected their shared experience of displacement and detention. The next morning, McLeod approached Greta as she stood near the perimeter fence, gazing at the snow-covered landscape that stretched toward the Irish Sea. The view reminded her of winters in her childhood home near Berlin, though the flat island terrain bore little resemblance to the Brandenburg countryside where she had grown up. She had been contemplating a letter from relatives in America that had arrived through the Red Cross, heavily censored but containing enough information to confirm that some members of her family had successfully emigrated before the war. "That song you sang last night," McLeod began, his voice carrying a gentleness that contrasted with his usual military bearing. "What was it?" Greta turned, surprised by his question and the genuine interest it reflected. She had grown accustomed to interactions with guards that were purely functional, focused on maintaining order and security, rather than personal connection or cultural exchange. "It's a lullaby from my homeland," she replied, her English precise despite the emotional weight of the memory. "My mother used to sing it to me when I was small, before everything changed. The song carries memories of peaceful times, when families could be together and children could sleep without fear of persecution or displacement." McLeod nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching into a rare smile that transformed his usually stern expression. "It was Beautiful, he said, the simple word carrying more meaning than its brevity suggested. The acknowledgement represented a breakthrough in the psychological barriers that military training and wartime suspicion had erected between guards and internees, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended national and ideological divisions. Greta studied him for a moment, noting the genuine emotion in his eyes and the way his posture had relaxed from its usual military stiffness. "Thank you, Sergeant, for the coats and blankets," she said. "We appreciate it more than you can know. The cold here is different from what we knew in London, more penetrating and persistent. Without your intervention, some of us might have become seriously ill." McLeod shifted uncomfortably, his training having taught him to maintain professional distance from internees, while his growing personal investment in their welfare created internal conflict. "Just doing my duty," he replied, though both he and Greta understood that his actions had gone well beyond the minimum requirements of camp regulations. The internment guidelines required adequate care for detainees, but the specific interpretation of that requirement often varied based on available resources and individual initiative. As the weeks passed, the relationship between McLeod and the internees evolved in ways that surprised everyone involved. He arranged for additional medical supplies to be distributed to the women, recognizing that their diverse backgrounds and ages created different health needs that required individual attention. He ensured they had access to educational materials and writing supplies, understanding the psychological importance of maintaining intellectual engagement and communication with the outside world. Perhaps most significantly, McLeod facilitated the delivery of letters to and from their families and friends through the International Red Cross and other approved channels, a service that was technically available to all internees, but often delayed by bureaucratic inefficiency and security reviews. He understood the psychological importance of maintaining contact with loved ones and made personal efforts to expedite the mail process, even when it required additional paperwork and coordination with other agencies. The women, in turn, shared stories of their lives before internment, their hopes and dreams for the future, and their perspectives on the war that had brought them to this unlikely situation. Greta spoke of her medical training and her desire to help heal the wounds that conflict had inflicted on both combatants and civilians. Maria described her love of cooking and her dreams of opening a restaurant that would serve dishes from her native Italy to her adopted British community. Elena shared memories of her work in London schools, where she had helped immigrant children adapt to British culture while maintaining connections to their heritage. Ingrid talked about the British family she had worked for, and her hope that the children she had cared for would remember her fondly, despite the circumstances of her departure. Anna, despite the cloud of suspicion that surrounded her case, spoke movingly of her desire to clear her name and rebuild her life in a Britain that could accept her as a loyal resident, rather than a potential threat. One particularly cold night in January 1944, McLeod found himself seated in the guard station, sipping a cup of tea that had been brewed strong enough to provide some warmth against the bitter cold that had settled over the island. The small building was heated by a coal stove, but drafts through gaps in the walls made it difficult to maintain a comfortable temperature. He was reviewing the daily reports and planning the next day's activities when there was a soft knock at the door. Maria stepped inside, holding a small bundle wrapped in brown cloth, her breath visible in the cold air that filled the space. "I made this for you," she said, extending the bundle toward McLeod with hands that trembled slightly from cold and nervousness. The gesture was unprecedented in their relationship, representing a level of personal connection that crossed the boundaries typically maintained between guards and internees. McLeod took the bundle, unwrapping the cloth to reveal a knitted scarf made from yarn that had been unraveled from an old sweater and reworked into a new pattern. The stitches were uneven, reflecting the challenging conditions under which it had been created, and the yarn showed signs of previous use, but the scarf was warm and functional. More importantly, it represented hours of patient work and a gesture of gratitude that transcended the formal relationships that governed camp life. "Thank you," McLeod said, genuinely touched by the gesture and the thought it represented. He wrapped the scarf around his neck, feeling its warmth and the care that had gone into its creation. The gift challenged his understanding of the guard-internee relationship and forced him to confront the growing personal connections that had developed despite his efforts to maintain professional distance. Maria smiled, her face lighting up with an expression of satisfaction and relief. "It's the least we can do," she said. You have shown us kindness when you could have remained indifferent. In our countries, we have a saying that kindness creates obligations that can only be fulfilled with more kindness. This is our small attempt to begin that repayment. As winter gradually gave way to spring in 1944, the atmosphere within the camp underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The rigid lines between guard and internee began to blur, replaced by relationships based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than simple authority and compliance. McLeod's example had influenced other guards, who began to see the internees as individuals with their own stories and struggles, rather than anonymous security risks to be contained and controlled. The improved morale was evident in various ways throughout the camp. Internees showed greater cooperation with daily routines and regulations, reducing the need for disciplinary measures and creating a more peaceful environment for everyone. The women's group had expanded their evening activities to include other internees, creating informal concerts and educational programs that provided entertainment and intellectual stimulation for the entire camp population. Dame Joanna Cruikshank took notice of the improved conditions and, while she maintained strict adherence to security protocols, she recognized the value of McLeod's approach in creating a more stable and manageable environment. Reports to the Home Office noted the positive developments while carefully emphasizing the continued effectiveness of security measures and the absence of any incidents that might suggest compromised vigilance. The success at Russian reflected broader changes in British policy towards civilian internment as the war progressed and the immediate threat of invasion receded. Government officials recognized that well-treated internees were more likely to provide useful information about conditions in enemy territories, less likely to attempt escapes or cause disciplinary problems, and more valuable as potential allies in post-war reconstruction efforts. The investment in humane treatment was seen as both morally correct and strategically beneficial. In May 1945, news of Germany's surrender reached the camp through official channels and internee communication networks. The announcement created mixed emotions among both guards and internees, as the end of the war in Europe meant that long-separated families might be reunited, but also that the unique community that had developed within the camp would be dissolved. For many, the relationships formed during internment had become important sources of support and understanding. The process of release and repatriation was complex, as many internees faced uncertain futures in a post-war world that had been dramatically transformed by 6 years of conflict. Some, like Greta, had lost their homes and possessions and faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives from nothing. Others, like Maria, discovered that their pre-war employment and housing arrangements no longer existed, requiring them to start over in communities that might still harbor suspicion about their wartime experiences. The night before the first group of internees was scheduled for release, the women gathered in the common area for a final singing session. They performed the lullaby that had become their signature song, their voices carrying across the camp with a poignancy that reflected both sadness at parting and hope for the future. The melody had evolved over the months to include new verses that captured their experiences of displacement, survival, and unexpected friendship. McLeod stood at a distance, listening to the familiar harmony that had become such an important part of the camp's evening routine. When the song ended, Greta approached him, walking slowly across the courtyard that had been the site of so many daily interactions and small kindnesses. The approaching separation weighed heavily on both of them, as they had developed a relationship that transcended the formal boundaries of their respective roles. "We're leaving tomorrow," she said softly, her voice carrying the mixed emotions that the prospect of freedom and return to civilian life inevitably created. After years of internment, the idea of returning to a world that had been transformed by war and loss was both exciting and terrifying. The Britain she would re-enter bore little resemblance to the country where she had built her pre-war life as a refugee seeking safety and opportunity. McLeod nodded, his own emotions carefully controlled but clearly present in his expression. "I know," he replied simply. The brevity of his response reflected the difficulty of finding words adequate to the moment and the relationship they had developed over the months of shared experience within the confines of the camp. Greta hesitated before reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small, worn photograph that had somehow survived her internment and the subsequent years of uncertainty. It depicted a group of medical colleagues from her time at the London hospital, their faces bright with the optimism and purpose that had characterized their work before the war disrupted everything. "This is from my life before," she said, her voice thick with emotion. These people believed in healing and helping others regardless of their nationality or background. I hope to find that spirit again in the world we're returning to. MacLeod took the photograph, studying the image of young professionals who represented hope for the future and the possibility of rebuilding lives and communities that had been shattered by conflict. They look like good people, he said, recognizing in their expressions the same strength and resilience that had sustained Greta through the challenges of displacement and internment. The photograph represented not just a personal connection, but a symbol of the professional and social bonds that war had disrupted, but not destroyed. Greta smiled, her eyes bright with tears that reflected both sadness at parting and anticipation of reunion with the life she had been forced to abandon. "Thank you for everything," she said. "You showed us that even in the most difficult circumstances, humanity can survive and flourish. That lesson will stay with us as we work to rebuild our lives and our communities. The kindness you showed was not just personal, but represented the best values of your nation and your people." The next morning, as the internees boarded the boats that would take them back to the mainland and their new lives as free citizens, MacLeod stood by the camp gate, watching the departure of people who had become more than just charges under his supervision. As the vessels pulled away from the harbor, their wakes spreading across the calm waters of the Irish Sea, Greta leaned over the rail of one boat, waving farewell to the man who had shown her that compassion could survive even in the midst of global conflict. MacLeod raised his hand in return, the scarf that Maria had knitted for him wrapped snugly around his neck despite the warming weather. The gesture served as a reminder of the connections that had been formed, and the lessons that had been learned about the possibility of maintaining humanity, even in the most challenging circumstances. As the boats disappeared over the horizon, and the camp began the process of decommissioning that would return the Isle of Man to its peacetime role as a holiday destination, MacLeod turned and walked back into the facility that had been his home and workplace for the past several years. The echoes of the evening lullabies seemed to linger in the air, a reminder of the transformation that had occurred within the camp's boundaries, and the proof that individual acts of kindness could create ripples of positive change, even in the darkest of times. The experience at Russian would be documented in official reports and personal memoirs, contributing to the historical record of how civilian internment was conducted during the Second World War. The relationships formed between guards and internees demonstrated that, even in situations of enforced detention, the fundamental human capacity for empathy and connection could transcend national boundaries and political divisions, creating hope for a more peaceful and understanding world in the post-war era. If you found this story of compassion during wartime as moving as we did, please give this video a thumbs up and let us know in the comments what you think about these remarkable acts of humanity in the darkest of times. Your engagement helps us bring more of these incredible historical stories to light. If you're not already subscribed to our channel, we'd love to have you join our community of history enthusiasts. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos exploring the untold stories that shaped our world. What other stories of unexpected kindness during World War II would you like us to cover? Share your suggestions in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often inspire our next videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story where history comes alive.